In a kingdom where justice was supposed to be blind, Judge Alaric stood out as someone who seemed more interested in bending the law than upholding it. The courtroom he presided over was always packed, not because people believed in fairness, but because they were curious about what outrageous thing he would do next. Alaric wasn't just any judge. He was known for his sharp tongue, his arrogance, and his knack for twisting laws to favor those with deep pockets. To many, he was untouchable, a man who wielded power like a sword, cutting down anyone who dared oppose him. On this particular morning, the air in the courtroom felt heavier than usual. Captain Evard, a respected member of the Royal Guard, had arrived to represent a young soldier accused of stealing valor, a crime that carried severe consequences if proven true. The soldier, barely out of his teens, sat nervously beside Evard, clutching the edges of his seat. Everyone knew this case was tricky. It involved claims of forged medals and false honors, accusations that could tarnish not only the individual, but also the reputation of the entire Royal Guard. As the proceedings began, Judge Alaric leaned back in his chair, his expression one of boredom mixed with disdain. He glanced at Captain Evard with thinly veiled contempt. Alaric didn't like guardsmen. They reminded him too much of everything he wasn't: honorable, loyal, and incorruptible. "Let's get on with it," he muttered, waving a dismissive hand toward Evard. His tone set the stage for what promised to be a contentious trial. Captain Evard rose from his seat, his posture straight and commanding. Dressed in the polished armor of the Royal Guard, he exuded authority without needing to say a word. When he spoke, his voice was calm yet firm, each syllable dripping with purpose. "Your Honor," he began, addressing the judge respectfully, "the charges against Private Landon are baseless and stem from misinformation spread by rivals within the military ranks." Evard laid out the facts clearly, presenting documents and witness testimonies that supported the young soldier's innocence. The gallery listened intently, captivated by the captain's eloquence. But as the evidence piled up, Judge Alaric grew visibly agitated. This wasn't how things usually went in his courtroom. Normally, defendants cowered under his glare, and cases wrapped up quickly with verdicts swayed by bribes or threats. Today, however, Evard refused to back down, challenging every biased ruling Alaric attempted to impose. The tension between them was palpable. Alaric shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his patience wearing thin. He interrupted Evard mid-sentence, snapping, "Enough of your theatrics. I know how these soldiers operate. They stick together no matter what." His words hung in the air, heavy with accusation. The crowd exchanged uneasy glances. Even the court clerks paused their writing, sensing the brewing storm. What made matters worse was Alaric's demeanor. He didn't even try to hide his irritation. Instead, he leaned forward, resting his elbows on the bench, and fixed Evard with a cold stare. "You think your fancy titles and shiny armor make you better than me," he sneered. "I've seen men like you come and go, always preaching honor while hiding behind their badges." Evard didn't flinch. If anything, his composure only seemed to infuriate Alaric further. The judge's face reddened as he continued his tirade, oblivious to the murmurs spreading through the room. People whispered among themselves, some shaking their heads in disbelief. No one had ever dared speak to a member of the Royal Guard this way, especially not in such a public setting. Yet here was Judge Alaric, openly mocking one of the most revered figures in the kingdom. Little did he know, his insults were about to lead him down a path he couldn't escape. Unbeknownst to him, a young scribe sitting quietly nearby had been documenting every word. Her name was Leela, and she had her own reasons for wanting to see justice served. As Alaric's rant reached its peak, the wheels of fate began turning faster than he could imagine. The tension in the courtroom was reaching a boiling point. Judge Alaric, now visibly seething, leaned forward on his bench, his knuckles white, as he gripped the edge of the wooden surface. His face was flushed with anger, and his eyes narrowed into slits as he glared at Captain Evard. "You think you can lecture me about principles?" he snarled, his voice rising to a near shout. "Let me tell you something, Captain. Your so-called honor is nothing but a facade. You guardsmen strut around like you're above everyone else. But we all know the truth." Evard didn't flinch. Instead, he met Alaric's gaze with steely resolve, his expression unchanging. "If there are truths to be revealed, Your Honor," he replied calmly, "then let them come to light. But personal attacks will not change the facts of this case." The crowd murmured again, some nodding in agreement while others exchanged nervous glances. It was clear that Alaric's behavior was crossing a line, even for those who had grown accustomed to his harsh demeanor. Alaric wasn't done. Emboldened by his fury, or perhaps blinded by it, he pressed further. "Oh, I'll reveal plenty," he snapped, jabbing a finger toward Evard. "Starting with how little respect I have for your esteemed royal guard. Do you really think you're untouchable? That your shiny armor protects you from accountability?" He paused, leaning back in his chair with a smug smirk. "Well, let me make one thing crystal clear. You're nothing but puppets dancing to the king's tune. And if I wanted to, I could have any one of you arrested where you stand." The gallery erupted in gasps. Even the court clerks froze mid-note, their pens hovering uncertainly over their papers. No one had ever heard a judge speak so brazenly against the royal guard, an institution revered throughout the kingdom for its loyalty and discipline. Captain Evard's jaw tightened ever so slightly, but otherwise, he remained composed. "Your words reflect poorly on your character, Your Honor," he said firmly, his voice cutting through the murmurs. "And they do nothing to advance the cause of justice here today." But Alaric wasn't listening anymore. His rage had consumed him, pushing him beyond reason. In his arrogance, he made a fatal mistake, a comment that would seal his fate. "Justice," he scoffed, throwing his hands up in mock exasperation. "What does justice even mean when the king himself bends the rules whenever it suits him? Or do you expect me to believe he's some paragon of virtue too?" The room went deathly silent. Every eye turned to the judge, shock etched onto every face. Even Evard seemed momentarily stunned, though he quickly masked it with his usual stoicism. Alaric, realizing what he'd just said, paled slightly but tried to laugh it off. "Oh, come now," he said weakly, attempting to sound casual. "Surely no one believes I mean." But it was too late. The damage was done. Whispers spread like wildfire through the gallery. Someone muttered, "Did he just insult the king?" Another whispered, "This is treason." The atmosphere shifted dramatically, from tense anticipation to outright disbelief. People began looking around nervously, wondering who might act first. Unbeknownst to Alaric, his reckless words had already set something in motion. Outside the courtroom, Lila, the young scribe who had quietly slipped away earlier, was racing down the palace corridors, clutching her notebook tightly to her chest. Her heart pounded as she navigated the labyrinthine halls, dodging servants and guards along the way. She knew exactly where she needed to go: the office of Lord Chancellor Roderick, the highest-ranking official in the kingdom after the king himself. As she ran, snippets of the trial replayed in her mind: the insults, the threats, the thinly veiled contempt for the crown. Leela had always suspected Alaric of corruption, but she never imagined he would openly challenge the authority of the monarchy. This was bigger than anything she'd anticipated, and she felt a mix of fear and exhilaration coursing through her veins. If she could deliver her evidence to the right people, she might finally bring an end to the judge's reign of tyranny. Back in the courtroom, Alaric was still stammering, trying desperately to backtrack. But the mood had shifted irrevocably. Captain Evard watched him coolly, his arms crossed over his chest, sensing that the tide was turning. The spectators, once mere bystanders, now looked at the judge with undisguised disdain. For the first time in years, Alaric found himself truly alone and vulnerable. Little did he know, help wouldn't come. Instead, retribution was already on its way. Leela's footsteps echoed sharply against the marble floors of the palace as she hurried down the long, winding corridors. Her heart raced not just from the physical exertion, but also from the weight of what she carried in her hands, her notebook, filled with years' worth of meticulously documented evidence against Judge Alaric. Each page was a thread in the web of corruption she had been quietly unraveling. And now, those threads were about to be pulled together in a way that could change everything. As she turned a corner, nearly colliding with a servant carrying a tray of silver goblets, Leela forced herself to slow down. She couldn't afford to draw too much attention. Taking a deep breath, she smoothed her hair and adjusted her scribe's robes, trying to look calm despite the storm brewing inside her. The last thing she needed was for someone to question why a lowly scribe was rushing through the royal halls like a messenger on urgent business. Finally, she reached the grand oak doors of Lord Chancellor Roderick's office. They loomed before her, intricately carved with symbols of justice and authority, a stark contrast to the man whose actions she had come to expose. For a moment, doubt crept into her mind. What if they didn't believe her? What if Alaric's influence extended even here, shielding him from accountability? But then she remembered the faces in the courtroom, the shock, the anger, the hope, and she pushed those fears aside. This wasn't just about her anymore. It was about everyone who had suffered under Alaric's tyranny. Summoning her courage, Leela knocked firmly on the door. A muffled voice from within called out, "Enter." She pushed the heavy door open and stepped inside, finding herself face to face with Lord Chancellor Roderick. He was an imposing figure, tall and broad-shouldered, with sharp features that seemed chiseled from stone. His piercing gray eyes locked onto hers immediately, assessing her with a mixture of curiosity and skepticism. "Scribe," he said, his tone measured but firm. "What brings you here without summons?" Leela swallowed hard, clutching her notebook tightly to her chest. "Your Grace," she began, bowing deeply to show respect, "I bring urgent news regarding Judge Alaric. Matters, grave matters, have come to light during today's trial." Roderick raised an eyebrow, leaning back in his chair. "Grave matters, you say? Speak plainly, girl." Taking another steadying breath, Leela launched into her explanation. She recounted every detail of the scene in the courtroom. Alaric's insults toward Captain Navard, his blatant disregard for due process, and most damning of all, his treasonous remarks about the king. As she spoke, Roderick's expression grew darker, his brow furrowing with each revelation. When she mentioned the insult directed at the monarchy, his jaw tightened visibly, and his fingers drummed impatiently on the armrest of his chair. "And this is where my notes come in," Leela continued, holding up her notebook. "For years, I've suspected Judge Alaric of corruption, bribery, coercion, falsified rulings. I've recorded it all. Today's events only confirm what I've long feared. He is unfit to serve, and his actions threaten the very foundation of our justice system." Roderick leaned forward, his gaze intense. "Do you have proof of these claims? Not just hearsay or supposition, but concrete evidence." Without hesitation, Leela placed the notebook on his desk and flipped it open to a marked section. There, neatly written in ink, were dates, names, amounts exchanged, and detailed accounts of Alaric's misconduct. Some entries included sketches of documents she had secretly copied during late-night sessions in the archives. Others contained testimony snippets from witnesses too afraid to come forward publicly. It was a treasure trove of incriminating information, laid out with precision and care. Roderick scanned the pages, his expression unreadable. After several tense moments, he closed the notebook and looked at Leela. "You understand the gravity of what you're doing," he said, his voice low and serious. "If this is false, or if your motives are anything less than pure, there will be consequences." "It's true, Your Grace," Leela replied earnestly, every word. "I may be just a scribe, but I swore an oath to serve the truth. That's why I'm here, to ensure justice prevails." Roderick studied her for a moment longer, then nodded curtly. "Very well. You've done your part. Now leave this matter to me." With that, he rose from his seat and strode toward the door, barking orders to summon senior members of the royal guard and advisors to his chamber. As Leela watched him go, a wave of relief washed over her, followed quickly by a sense of purpose. She had taken a risk, stepping out of the shadows to confront power head-on. But as she left the office and returned to the bustling corridors of the palace, she knew, back in the courtroom, Judge Alaric was still struggling to regain control of the situation. His earlier bravado had crumbled into a nervous fidgeting as he glanced around the room, searching for any sign of support, or at least indifference, from the spectators. But the crowd's demeanor had shifted entirely. Gone were the whispers of curiosity or amusement. Instead, there was an eerie silence, broken only by the occasional cough or shuffle of feet. Every eye in the room seemed fixed on him, not with fear or respect, but with quiet disdain. Captain Evard stood motionless beside Private Landon, his expression unreadable. He didn't gloat or press his advantage, knowing that justice would speak for itself soon enough. Instead, he simply waited, letting the weight of Alaric's own words hang heavy in the air. The young soldier next to him looked visibly relieved, sensing that the tide had turned in their favor. Suddenly, the heavy wooden doors of the courtroom burst open with a resounding crash, causing everyone to turn in unison. 2 senior members of the royal guard marched in, flanked by armored knights carrying halberds. Their presence commanded immediate attention, and the murmurs that had filled the room moments ago died down instantly. At their lead was Captain Garrick, a grizzled veteran known for his loyalty to the crown and his no-nonsense approach to duty. Behind him followed Lord Chancellor Roderick, his face stern and unyielding. The procession moved swiftly toward the bench, where Judge Alaric sat frozen, his mouth slightly agape. For once, he seemed unable to find words to fill the silence. When the group stopped before him, Captain Garrick stepped forward, his voice booming across the chamber. "Judge Alaric," he declared, his tone leaving no room for argument, "you are under arrest for treasonous remarks against the crown and multiple counts of judicial misconduct." The courtroom erupted into chaos. Gasps filled the air as people turned to one another, wide-eyed and incredulous. Some rose from their seats to get a better view, while others whispered frantically about what they had just witnessed. Even the court clerks abandoned their posts, craning their necks to see the unfolding drama. Alaric, pale and trembling, stammered incoherently. This is absurd," he managed to choke out, slamming his fists onto the bench. "On what grounds do you dare accuse me? I am a judge of this kingdom." Lord Chancellor Roderick stepped forward, holding up Layla's notebook for all to see. "On these grounds," he said firmly, his voice cutting through the noise like a blade. Years' worth of documented evidence detailing bribery, coercion, falsified rulings, and now, most grievously, treasonous insults directed at His Majesty the King. He paused, allowing the gravity of his words to sink in. "Your actions have undermined the very foundations of our justice system. You will answer for them." For a moment, Alaric looked as though he might protest further, but the steely resolve in Roderick's gaze silenced him. The knights moved closer, surrounding the bench. One of them reached out, gripping Alaric's arm firmly but without unnecessary roughness. "You will come quietly, sir," the knight said, his tone neutral but firm. Alaric hesitated, his pride warring with the reality of his situation. Finally, realizing resistance was futile, he allowed himself to be led away. As he passed through the rows of spectators, some glared at him, while others avoided his eyes altogether. He stumbled slightly as he descended the steps, his once imposing figure reduced to that of a broken man. Captain Garrick turned to address the stunned audience. "Let this serve as a reminder," he announced, his voice echoing through the chamber, "that no one is above the law, not even those who enforce it. Justice will prevail always." As the doors closed behind Alaric and his escort, the courtroom remained eerily silent. It was as if the weight of what had just transpired was still settling over everyone present. Then, slowly, applause began to ripple through the room. It started softly, hesitant at first, but grew louder and more confident until the entire gallery erupted in cheers. People clapped not just for the downfall of a corrupt judge, but for the restoration of hope in a system they had long feared was beyond repair. Captain Ivard exchanged a glance with Private Landon, offering the young soldier a small, reassuring smile. "It's over," he said quietly. "You're free to go home." Landon nodded, tears welling up in his eyes. "Thank you, sir," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "I don't know how to repay you." "There's no need," Evard replied, placing a hand on the boy's shoulder. "Just live honorably. That's repayment enough." Meanwhile, outside the courtroom, Leela lingered near the entrance, watching as the scene unfolded. She felt a mix of relief and disbelief. Her years of secrecy and sacrifice had. The palace buzzed with activity as news of Judge Alaric's arrest spread like wildfire. Servants whispered in hushed tones, while courtiers exchanged knowing glances, their faces a mix of shock and satisfaction. In the grand hall where Lord Chancellor Roderick had convened an emergency meeting, the air was thick with tension. Senior members of the royal guard, advisors to the king, and key officials gathered around a long wooden table, their expressions grave. At the center of it all sat Layla's notebook, its worn cover now bearing the weight of justice. Roderick opened the session by summarizing the events of the day, his voice steady but tinged with anger. "We have before us undeniable proof of corruption within our judicial system," he began, tapping the notebook for emphasis. "Not only has Judge Alaric abused his position, but his treasonous remarks against His Majesty cannot go unpunished." He paused, scanning the room. "This is not just about one man. It is about restoring trust in the institutions that govern us." One of the advisors leaned forward, adjusting his spectacles. "What of the other judges?" he asked cautiously. "If Alaric has been allowed to act this way unchecked, how many others might be complicit?" The question hung heavily in the air. Captain Garrick, seated near the head of the table, nodded thoughtfully. "It's a valid concern," he said, "but we must proceed carefully. Accusations without evidence could destabilize the courts further. For now, let's focus on Alaric and use this case to set an example." Leela stood quietly at the edge of the room, her presence requested by Roderick himself. Though she felt out of place among such high-ranking individuals, she couldn't help but feel a sense of pride. Her years of quiet dedication had brought them here, to a moment where change seemed possible. When Roderick called upon her to explain her findings, she stepped forward nervously but spoke with clarity. "I've documented every instance I could find," she said, gesturing toward the notebook. "Bribery, coerced verdicts, falsified records. They're all there. Some cases date back years, involving wealthy merchants and even minor nobles who sought favorable rulings. But what truly sealed Alaric's fate was today's trial. His insults against the crown were witnessed by dozens, including Captain Ivard. Her words carried weight, and the assembly listened intently. One advisor scribbled notes furiously, while another muttered under his breath, "Unbelievable. How did we miss this for so long?" After hours of discussion, a plan began to take shape. Alaric would face trial, not in his own courtroom, but in a special tribunal overseen by trusted members of the judiciary and representatives from the royal guard. The charges ranged from corruption to treason, each supported by Leela's meticulous records. Witnesses, including Captain Ivard, and several victims of Alaric's schemes, were summoned to testify. Meanwhile, King Alden himself reviewed the documents brought forth. Seated in his private chambers, surrounded by flickering candlelight, he flipped through the pages with growing concern. The depth of Alaric's deceit shocked him, but what troubled him most was the realization that such corruption could fester unnoticed for so long. "This cannot happen again," he murmured to himself, his brow furrowed. "We need safeguards, measures to ensure transparency." By dawn, a royal decree was issued. It outlined sweeping reforms aimed at preventing future abuses of power. Judges would now undergo regular audits conducted by independent oversight committees, staffed by citizens chosen for their integrity. Additionally, New channels were established for reporting misconduct anonymously, ensuring that no one feared retaliation for speaking up. As word of these changes reached the public, hope began to blossom across the kingdom. People gathered in marketplaces and taverns, discussing the unprecedented turn of events. Many praised Captain Navard for standing firm against Alaric's tyranny, while others hailed Leela as a hero whose quiet courage had sparked monumental change. For Captain Navard, the incident served as both a victory and a reminder. Standing on the palace steps later that evening, he addressed a small group of guardsmen. "Today proves that honor isn't just a word, it's a responsibility," he told them. "We wear this armor not because we're better than others, but because we're held to higher standards. Let this be a lesson. Never compromise your principles, no matter the cost." Inside the palace, Leela reflected on everything that had transpired. She had always believed in justice, but she never imagined her efforts would lead to such profound transformation. As she walked through the corridors, servants greeted her warmly, some even bowing slightly, a gesture usually reserved for those of higher rank. Promoted to chief archivist, the days following Judge Alaric's arrest passed in a whirlwind of activity as the kingdom adjusted to the seismic shift in its judicial landscape. News of his downfall spread far beyond the palace walls, reaching every corner of the land, from bustling market towns to quiet rural villages. People gathered around hearths and tavern tables, recounting the story with a mix of awe and relief. For many, it was hard to believe that someone so powerful could be brought down by a single trial and the courage of an unassuming scribe. In the heart of the capital, preparations for Alaric's tribunal dominated conversations. The special court assembled to try him included some of the most respected figures in the realm. Retired judges known for their impartiality, senior members of the royal guard, and even representatives from the merchant class, who had long complained about corruption but feared retribution. It was a diverse panel, designed to reflect the voices of the people and ensure fairness, a stark contrast to the unchecked authority Alaric once wielded. When the tribunal convened, the courtroom was packed to capacity. Spectators lined up hours before sunrise, eager to witness history unfold. Guards stood at every entrance, ensuring order while preventing any attempts to disrupt the proceedings. Inside, the atmosphere was tense but electric, a mixture of anticipation and hope filling the air. Captain Ivard sat among the witnesses, his presence lending gravity to the occasion. Nearby, Leela occupied a reserved seat, her notebook resting on her lap, as if ready to document every moment. The charges against Alaric were read aloud, each accusation punctuated by gasps from the crowd. Bribery, coercion, falsified rulings, all laid bare for everyone to see. But it was the charge of treason that drew the sharpest reactions. When the prosecutor recounted Alaric's insult toward the king, murmurs turned into outright jeers. Even the guards struggled to maintain silence as emotions ran high. Alaric, now stripped of his robes and seated alone at the defendant's table, looked nothing like the arrogant judge who had once commanded fear. His usual bravado had evaporated, replaced by a pale, haggard figure trembling under the weight of his crimes. He tried to defend himself, stammering excuses and blaming others for his actions, but his words fell flat. Evidence from Leela's notebook was presented piece by piece, leaving no room for doubt. Witnesses testified about bribes they had paid, verdicts that had been twisted, and lives ruined by his greed. One particularly moving testimony came from a farmer named Thomas, whose family had lost their land due to one of Alaric's rigged decisions. "I worked that soil for 30 years, Thomas said, his voice shaking with emotion. "And he took it from me, for coins I'll never see again. My children went hungry because of him." As tears streamed down his face, the crowd erupted in sympathetic applause, forcing the tribunal to call for calm. By the end of the trial, there was little question of Alaric's guilt. The tribunal deliberated briefly before delivering its verdict. Guilty on all counts, the punishment was severe but fitting: exile to a remote border province, where he would live out his days under constant supervision. forbidden from ever holding public office or influencing legal matters again. Some argued that exile was too lenient, but the tribunal reasoned that making an example of Alaric mattered more than vengeance. As the gavel struck, signaling the conclusion of the case, cheers erupted throughout the courtroom. Outside, bells rang across the city, celebrating the triumph of justice over corruption. People spilled into the streets, hugging strangers, and raising banners bearing slogans like "Truth prevails" and "No one is above the law." For Captain Everard, the outcome reinforced his belief in the power of integrity. Standing outside the courthouse afterward, he addressed reporters and citizens alike. "This victory belongs to all of us," he declared. "To those who refused to stay silent, to those who sought truth, and especially to those who dared to challenge tyranny. Let this day remind us that honor is not just a word, it's a way of life." Leela, meanwhile, found herself thrust into the spotlight she had always shied away from. Promoted to chief archivist, she became a symbol of quiet bravery. Her promotion ceremony was attended by dignitaries and commoners alike, united in admiration for her role in exposing Alaric's crimes. Though uncomfortable with the attention, Leela embraced her new responsibilities, vowing to keep the courts transparent and accountable. As the sun set over the kingdom, casting golden light over the palace spires, a sense of renewal swept through the land. The fall of Judge Alaric wasn't just the end of a corrupt era. It marked the beginning of something greater. For the first time in years, people felt hope. The weeks that followed Judge Alaric's exile marked the dawn of a new chapter for the kingdom. The once dreaded courtroom where he had presided was stripped bare, its walls scrubbed clean as if to erase every trace of his corrupt legacy. In his place, a panel of 3 judges, each chosen for their integrity and dedication to fairness, was appointed to oversee cases. This collective leadership aimed to prevent any single individual from wielding unchecked power, ensuring decisions were made through collaboration rather than coercion. The reforms introduced by King Alden began to take root, transforming not just the courts but the entire system of governance. Independent oversight committees sprang up across the kingdom, staffed by ordinary citizens who volunteered their time to monitor judicial proceedings and report irregularities. These committees held public meetings, inviting input from anyone with concerns about the legal process. For the first time in years, people felt they had a voice, and more importantly, that their voices mattered. Leela, now chief archivist, threw herself into her work with renewed purpose. Her office became a hub of activity, filled with stacks of documents, ledgers, and letters from citizens praising her efforts or reporting suspicious activities. She worked tirelessly to create a transparent record-keeping system, one that would make it nearly impossible for corruption to fester unnoticed again. Though she missed the quiet anonymity of her old life, she found deep satisfaction in knowing her work was making a difference. Captain Everard returned to his duties within the Royal Guard, but he carried the lessons of the trial with him wherever he went. He spoke often to younger guardsmen, sharing stories of courage and conviction. "Honor isn't given," he told them during training sessions. "It's earned day by day, decision by decision. Stand firm when others falter, and remember, justice is worth fighting for." His words inspired many, earning him even greater respect among his peers. As news of the kingdom's transformation spread, neighboring lands took notice. Diplomats arrived at the palace, eager to learn how such sweeping reforms had been achieved without plunging the realm into chaos. King Alden welcomed them warmly, using the opportunity to emphasize the importance of transparency and accountability in leadership. "A strong nation isn't built on fear," he said during one banquet, raising his goblet high. "It's built on trust, the trust between ruler and subject, between law and citizen." The story of Judge Alaric's downfall became legend, recounted in songs sung by traveling minstrels, and depicted in murals painted on town square walls. Children played games reenacting the trial, with sticks serving as gavels and scraps of cloth tied around their necks as makeshift robes. Even Private Landon, whose innocence had sparked the chain of events, became a folk hero of sorts. He returned to his unit, greeted with cheers and pats on the back, his reputation restored and his spirit unbroken. But perhaps the most profound change occurred in the hearts of the people themselves. Where cynicism and distrust had once thrived, hope and determination now blossomed. Farmers, merchants, artisans, all walks of life, began participating more actively in civic matters, attending town hall meetings and volunteering for community projects. They realized that justice wasn't something handed down from above. It was something they could help shape together. One evening, as twilight bathed the capital in soft hues of orange and purple, Leela walked through the palace gardens, her notebook tucked under her arm. She paused beneath a sprawling oak tree, its branches swaying gently in the breeze. Closing her eyes, she listened to the distant hum of laughter and conversation drifting from the city below. It was a sound she hadn't heard in years, a symphony of unity and optimism. "You've done well," came a familiar voice behind her. Turning, she saw Captain Evard approaching, his armor gleaming faintly in the fading light. He offered her a small smile. "The kingdom owes you a debt it can never repay." Leela shook her head modestly. "I didn't do this alone," she replied. "It was everyone who refused to stay silent, everyone who believed in what was right. Justice belongs to all of us." Evard nodded thoughtfully. "Still, you lit the spark. And look at the fire it's become." Together, they stood in silence for a moment, watching as the stars began to twinkle in the darkening sky. The road ahead wouldn't always be easy. There would still be challenges, setbacks, and those who sought to exploit weaknesses. But for now, the kingdom basked in the glow of renewal, united by the belief that brighter days lay ahead.